In the grand
This
halls of Valdoria
cannot
Palace,
be
where centuries of
ignored
royal blood
any
have walked
longer.
before, Crown
We
Prince
must
Alexander
act
never imagined that the woman
decisively.
his father married
Brothers,
for love would harbor a
you
secret
must
so devastating it
understand
could
the
destroy
weight
the very
of
foundation
your
of the monarchy.
actions.
When a mysterious letter arrives bearing the royal seal of their enemy kingdom, it reveals a truth about his stepmother Queen Isabella's son that will force Alexander to choose between family loyalty and the survival of his throne. Some secrets are worth killing for, and in the world of royalty, trust is the most dangerous luxury of all. The morning mist clung to the ancient towers of Valdoria Palace like a shroud of secrets, and Crown Prince Alexander felt an unusual chill as he walked through the marble corridors toward his father's study. At 28, he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated trouble brewing within the palace walls, and today those signs were everywhere. The servants moved with hurried steps, their eyes avoiding his gaze. The guards stood more rigidly at their posts, and even the usually cheerful head butler, Marcus, had offered only a curt nod instead of his customary warm greeting. Something was terribly wrong in the kingdom of Valdoria, and Alexander suspected it had everything to do with the emergency council meeting his father, King Edmund, had called for this morning. As he approached the heavy oak doors of the royal study, Alexander could hear raised voices from within. His father's deep, commanding tone carried through the thick wood, punctuated by the sharper, more defensive voice of Queen Isabella, his stepmother. They had been married for 3 years now, and while Alexander had initially welcomed her presence in their lives, recent months had brought an uncomfortable tension that he couldn't quite identify. Alexander paused before knocking, his hand hovering over the ornate bronze handle. Through the crack beneath the door, he could see shadows moving back and forth, suggesting an animated conversation. His instincts told him to wait, to listen, but a sense of duty demanded he announce his presence. Before he could decide, the door swung open, revealing Queen Isabella's flushed face and blazing green eyes. "Alexander," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious distress written across her elegant features. "Your father is waiting for you." She brushed past him without another word, her silk gown rustling against the marble floor as she disappeared down the corridor. Alexander watched her go, noting the way her shoulders trembled slightly and how she clutched a handkerchief in her right hand. Whatever had transpired in that room had shaken her considerably. Inside the study, King Edmund stood with his back to the door, staring out the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. At 55, he remained an imposing figure, his broad shoulders still carrying the weight of the crown with dignity. But today, something in his posture suggested a burden heavier than usual. "Father," Alexander said, closing the door behind him and moving to stand beside the king. Edmund didn't turn immediately. Instead, he continued to gaze out at the perfectly manicured gardens where Queen Isabella's son Marcus was practicing archery with the royal guards. The young man, barely 23, had been welcomed into the palace when his mother married the king. He was charming, intelligent, and had quickly endeared himself to the court with his wit and apparent loyalty to the crown. "Tell me, son," Edmund finally spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What do you know about Marcus's life before he came to us?" The question caught Alexander off guard. "I know he lived in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria with Isabella before your marriage. He studied there, trained as a diplomat." "Why do you ask?" Edmund finally turned to face his son, and Alexander was shocked by what he saw. The king's usually bright blue eyes were clouded with worry, and deep lines of stress had appeared seemingly overnight around his mouth and forehead. In his hand, he held a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal. "This arrived by special courier this morning," Edmund said, holding up the parchment. "It's from King Roland of Theron." Alexander's blood ran cold. Theron was Valdoria's oldest enemy, a kingdom that had been at odds with them for over a century. Any communication from King Roland could only mean trouble, and official correspondence was unheard of given the long-standing hostilities between their nations. "What does he want?" Alexander asked, moving closer to examine the letter. "He wants us to know the truth about the man living in our palace, eating at our table, and privy to our most sensitive state secrets," Edmund replied grimly. "According to Roland, Marcus is not simply Isabella's son from a previous relationship, as we believed." The king paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Alexander felt his heart rate increase as he waited for his father to continue. "Roland claims that Marcus is his son, conceived during a secret affair between him and Isabella 15 years ago. More than that, he alleges that Marcus has been reporting our military movements, our diplomatic strategies, and our economic plans back to Theron for the past 2 years." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of his father's desk for support. The implications were staggering. If Roland's claims were true, It meant that Isabella had brought a spy directly into the heart of their kingdom, and that spy had access to information that could destroy Valdoria. "That's impossible," Alexander said, though even as he spoke, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed began falling into place. Marcus's frequent trips to visit friends in neighboring kingdoms. His unusual interest in military matters for someone supposedly focused on diplomacy. The way conversations seemed to pause when he entered rooms during sensitive discussions. "I want to believe it's impossible," Edmund replied, sinking into his leather chair. "But Roland has provided detailed intelligence reports that only someone with access to our inner circle could have compiled. Troop movements that were discussed only in closed council sessions. Details about our grain reserves that are known to fewer than a dozen people. Information about our alliance negotiations with the Kingdom of Moravia that hasn't even been finalized yet." Alexander began pacing the room, his mind racing through the implications. "Have you confronted Isabel about this? That's what you overheard when you arrived," Edmund admitted. "I showed her the letter and demanded an explanation. She became hysterical, denied everything, claimed that Roland is trying to destroy our marriage and split our kingdom from within. What do you believe?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in his hands. "I want to believe my wife," he said finally, "but the evidence is compelling, and the details are too specific to be fabricated." Roland even provided dates and locations of secret meetings between Marcus and Theronian agents. Alexander stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on his father. "What are you going to do?" "That's why I called you here," Edmund replied. "This decision affects not just me, but the future of our kingdom. If Marcus is indeed a spy, then we're not just dealing with betrayal, we're dealing with treason. The penalty for treason is death, but executing him would mean declaring war on Theron and potentially destroying my marriage to Isabella." The weight of the situation settled heavily on Alexander's shoulders. As Crown Prince, he would inherit this crisis along with the throne. Every decision made now would have repercussions for years to come. "We need proof beyond Roland's word," Alexander said carefully. "If we're going to accuse Marcus of treason, we need evidence that would stand up in a royal court." Edmund nodded slowly. "I've already dispatched our most trusted agents to investigate the claims. But Alexander, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that everything we believed about our family has been a lie." Before Alexander could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the study. Without waiting for permission, Marcus himself entered the room, his handsome face bright with enthusiasm from his archery practice. He was tall and lean, with the same green eyes as his mother, and an easy smile that had charmed the entire court. "Your Majesty, Alexander," he said with a respectful bow. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to report that the new security protocols you requested for the eastern border have been implemented successfully." Alexander felt his stomach drop. The eastern border security protocols had been discussed in a private meeting just yesterday, attended by only the king, Alexander, and 3 trusted advisors. If Marcus knew about them, it meant either someone in that room had told him or he had access to information through other means. Edmund's face remained carefully neutral, but Alexander could see the tension in his father's jaw. "Thank you for the update, Marcus. That will be all." As Marcus left the room with another bow, Alexander and his father exchanged meaningful looks. The young man's knowledge of classified information was either an innocent coincidence or the first piece of evidence supporting Roland's explosive claims. "We need to be very careful from here," Edmund said quietly once they were alone again. "If Marcus is innocent, our suspicions could destroy our family. If he's guilty, one wrong move could give him time to escape or pass along information that could be used against us in a war." Alexander nodded grimly. "I'll start my own investigation immediately. I'll be discreet, but thorough." And Alexander, his father added, his voice heavy with sorrow, "Prepare yourself for the possibility that the confrontation ahead may tear our family apart forever." As Alexander left his father's study, his mind was already working through the steps he would need to take. He would start by reviewing Marcus's activities over the past months, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. He would quietly question trusted staff members about any unusual behavior they might have observed. And he would watch Marcus carefully, looking for any signs that might confirm or deny the terrible accusations. The young prince had always known that wearing the crown would require difficult decisions, but he had never imagined that his first real test would involve questioning the loyalty of someone he had come to consider a brother. As he walked through the palace corridors, Alexander realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated, and that the next few days would determine not just the fate of one young man, but the future of the entire kingdom.
The investigation was about to begin, and with it, a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the royal family.
In the distance, Alexander could still hear the sound of arrows hitting their targets in the practice yard. each thud echoing like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning.
The candles in Alexander's private chambers flickered against the stone walls as he spread documents across his desk in the early hours before dawn. Sleep had been impossible since his conversation with his father 3 days ago, and every moment spent in Marcus's company felt like walking through a minefield.
The young prince had become a master of maintaining normal conversation while internally cataloging every word, every gesture, every seemingly innocent question that might reveal hidden motives. His investigation had already yielded disturbing results.
Alexander had discreetly accessed the palace's visitor logs and discovered that Marcus had received private correspondence from at least 6 different kingdoms over the past year, far more than would be expected for someone supposedly focused on domestic diplomacy. More troubling still, 3 of these kingdoms were known to have hostile relationships with Valdoria, though they maintained the pretense of neutrality.
A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Alexander quickly gathered the papers and slipped them into a locked drawer before calling for the visitor to enter.
To his surprise, it was Sir Geoffrey, his father's most trusted advisor and longtime friend, who stepped into the room. The elderly man's weathered face showed the strain of recent events, and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled.
"Your Highness," Geoffrey said, bowing slightly before glancing around the room to ensure they were alone. "Forgive the early hour, but I have information that cannot wait." Alexander gestured for the old advisor to sit in the chair by the fireplace. "What have you discovered?" Geoffrey's hands trembled slightly as he pulled a small leather pouch from beneath his cloak. "Our agents in Theron have confirmed portions of King Roland's letter."
There is indeed a young man matching Marcus's description who has been seen entering and leaving the Theronian capital regularly over the past 18 months. The advisor opened the pouch and withdrew several small items: a seal bearing the Theronian coat of arms, a coded letter written in what appeared to be Marcus's handwriting, and a small silver pendant that Alexander recognized immediately.
It was identical to one that Marcus wore daily, claiming it had been a gift from his mother. "Where did you find these?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Hidden in a hollowed-out book in Marcus's private chamber," Geoffrey replied grimly. "Our search was conducted while he was attending morning prayers with the Queen."
"There's more, Your Highness. The coded letter, once deciphered, contains detailed information about the positioning of our naval fleet and the location of our emergency food stores."
Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. The naval positioning was classified information that had been discussed in a closed session just 2 weeks ago, and the emergency food stores were a closely guarded secret known only to the royal family and 3 senior advisors. If Marcus had access to this information, it could only mean one thing: the accusations were true. "Has my father seen these?" Alexander asked.
"Not yet. I brought them to you first because..." Geoffrey paused, seeming to struggle with his words.
"Because there's something else, something that complicates matters considerably." The old advisor stood and walked to the window, his silhouette outlined against the pre-dawn light. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that Queen Isabella may not be an innocent victim in this affair." Alexander's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "We found correspondence suggesting that her marriage to your father was arranged specifically to provide Marcus with access to the palace. The letters indicate that this plan has been in development for over 5 years, long before she ever met the king." The implications hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. If Geoffrey's findings were accurate, it meant that Isabella's entire relationship with his father had been built on deception. Every smile, every tender moment, every declaration of love had been part of an elaborate scheme to infiltrate the royal family. "My father cannot know about this yet," Alexander said firmly. "Not until we have absolute proof. The revelation could destroy him." Geoffrey nodded in understanding. "What would you have me do with the evidence?" "Secure it safely, but keep it from my father until we've gathered enough information to present a complete picture," Alexander replied. "And Geoffrey, we need to be extremely careful. If Marcus suspects we're onto him, he could disappear, taking valuable intelligence with him. Or worse, he could accelerate whatever plan he and his handlers have in motion." As Geoffrey prepared to leave, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to confront Marcus myself, today. I'll arrange a private meeting and present him with some of the evidence. His reaction will tell us everything we need to know."
Your Highness, that's extremely dangerous, Geoffrey protested. "If he is indeed a trained agent, confronting him directly could put you at risk."
"The risk is worth it," Alexander replied.
"We need to know the full extent of their operation, and Marcus might be more willing to talk to someone he considers family than to face a formal tribunal." After Geoffrey left, Alexander spent the remaining hours before sunrise preparing for what might be the most important conversation of his life.
He reviewed everything he knew about Marcus's behavior, looking for psychological leverage points that might encourage the young man to confess.
He practiced different approaches, from gentle questioning to direct accusation, trying to anticipate how someone trained in espionage might respond. When the sun finally rose over Valdoria Palace, Alexander felt as ready as he could be for the confrontation ahead.
He found Marcus in the palace library, a vast room filled with ancient texts and historical documents. The young man was seated at a reading table, apparently engrossed in a book about military strategy.
The irony was not lost on Alexander. "Good morning," Alexander said, approaching the table with what he hoped appeared to be casual friendliness.
Marcus looked up with his characteristic warm smile. "Alexander, good morning. I was just reading about the Battle of Westmarch. Fascinating tactics used by both sides. What brings you to the library so early?" Alexander sat down across from Marcus, studying the young man's face carefully. "I wanted to have a private conversation with you."
"There are some things we need to discuss." Something flickered in Marcus's green eyes, a momentary tightening around the corners that suggested alertness despite his relaxed demeanor. "Of course."
"What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about your background, your life before you came to Valdoria." Alexander began carefully. "You've mentioned studying diplomacy in Astoria, but I realized I don't know much about your specific experiences there." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering.
"It wasn't particularly exciting, I'm afraid, mostly theoretical studies, some practical training in negotiation and protocol. Rather dry material, really." "Did you travel much during your studies? Visit other kingdoms, perhaps?" "Occasionally," Marcus replied, though Alexander noticed a slight pause before the answer. "Educational trips mostly."
Nothing too extensive. Alexander decided to push harder.
"I find it interesting that you seem so well informed about our military operations. Yesterday you mentioned the Eastern Border Protocols." "That information was classified." For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked slightly.
His hand moved unconsciously to the silver pendant at his throat, the twin to the one Jeffrey had found hidden in his room. I must have overheard something in passing," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its confident tone. "You know how servants talk. Information has a way of spreading through the palace." "Does it?" Alexander asked, reaching into his jacket to withdraw the coded letter Jeffrey had discovered. He placed it on the table between them, watching as Marcus's face went completely pale. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Marcus stared at the letter, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid.
When he finally looked up at Alexander, the mask of innocence had completely fallen away, replaced by something cold and calculating. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked quietly.
"Long enough," Alexander replied, though in truth the confirmation still felt like a punch to the stomach. Despite all the evidence, part of him had hoped that Marcus would have an innocent explanation, that the young man he had come to care for as a brother was not a traitor.
Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," Alexander said.
"The penalty for treason is death, but I'm willing to consider alternatives if you cooperate fully. I need to know everything. Who you're working for, what information you've passed along, and what operations are currently in motion against Valdoria."
Marcus laughed bitterly. "You think it's that simple?"
"You think I can just confess everything and walk away? I think you care about the people in this palace despite what you've done." Alexander replied.
"I've seen you with my father, with the staff, with me. Some of that affection had to be genuine. You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice heavy, with an emotion Alexander couldn't identify. "This isn't just about political intelligence or military advantage. The plans that have been set in motion,
"They're bigger than you realize, and they're already too far along to stop." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine.
"What plans?" Before Marcus could answer, the library doors burst open, and Queen Isabella rushed in, her face flushed and her eyes wild with panic.
"Marcus!"
she called out, then stopped abruptly when she saw Alexander sitting at the table with her son. "Alexander, I was looking for Marcus. We need to, I wanted to." Her gaze fell on the coded letter sitting on the table between the two young men, and Alexander watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. She knew immediately that their deception had been uncovered. "Run," she whispered to Marcus, her voice barely audible. "Run now.
but Marcus remained seated, his shoulders sagging in defeat.
It's too late, Mother. He knows everything.
Isabella's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank into a nearby chair, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though it wasn't clear whether she was speaking to Marcus or to Alexander.
"I never wanted it to go this far." Alexander looked between the woman who had been his stepmother and the young man who had been like a brother, feeling the full weight of their betrayal settling on his shoulders. The confrontation was far from over, but already he could see that the consequences would reach far beyond anything he had imagined.
"Tell me about the plans you mentioned," he said to Marcus, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Tell me what's coming for Valdoria." The silence in the library stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap under the weight of revelation and betrayal. Alexander watched as Isabella buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing off the ancient stone walls. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, staring at the coded letter as if it might disappear if he looked hard enough. The comfortable world that Alexander had known for the past 3 years was crumbling around him, and he realized that the worst was yet to come.
"The plans," Alexander repeated, his voice cutting through Isabella's weeping. "I need to know what's being planned against Valdoria." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes to meet Alexander's gaze, and the young prince was shocked by what he saw there.
It wasn't the cold calculation of a trained spy, but rather a deep, bone-weary sadness that seemed to age him beyond his 23 years. "You have to understand," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted any of this. I was 10 years old when they first told me what I would have to do. 10 years old when I learned that my entire life would be a lie." Alexander felt his anger warring with an unexpected sympathy. Despite everything, Marcus had been just a child when this conspiracy began.
"Who are they? Who gave you these orders?"
"Not just King Roland of Theron," Marcus replied, glancing at his mother before continuing. "There's an alliance, a secret coalition of 5 kingdoms that have been planning Valdoria's downfall for over a decade. Theron, Astoria, Moravia, Keldar, and Nordheim.
They call themselves the Eastern Alliance. The blood drained from Alexander's face.
Those 5 kingdoms surrounded Valdoria on nearly all sides. If they were working together, it would represent the greatest threat the kingdom had ever faced."
"That's impossible," Alexander said, though even as he spoke he realized how perfectly it would explain the intelligence Marcus had been gathering. "Moravia is our ally.
We've been negotiating a trade agreement with them for months." Marcus shook his head sadly. "The trade negotiations are a sham, designed to gather information about your economic vulnerabilities. Moravia has been part of the alliance since the beginning." Isabella finally lifted her tear-stained face from her hands.
"Alexander, you have to believe me when I say that I fell in love with your father. That part wasn't planned.
When I agreed to this marriage, I thought I could protect Edmund somehow, find a way to minimize the damage, but you didn't," Alexander said coldly.
You brought a spy into our home, into our family. Every secret shared, every moment of trust, every family dinner was part of a lie." "I know," Isabella whispered.
"And I've regretted it every day since I realized how much I love your father, but by then it was too late to stop what we had set in motion." Alexander turned back to Marcus. "What specific plans are in motion? What intelligence have you passed along?" Marcus hesitated, looking between his mother and Alexander.
Finally, he seemed to make a decision. 3 days from now, during the Harvest Festival, when the palace guard will be reduced for the public celebrations, Theronian ships will attack our northern ports, while Astorian forces cross the southern border.
"The attacks are designed to draw your military forces away from the capital. And then?" Alexander asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer.
"Then a small force of elite soldiers, already positioned within 50 miles of the palace, will move to capture or kill the royal family," Marcus continued. "The intelligence I provided included detailed maps of the palace layout, guard rotations, and secret passages.
They know exactly how to get to your father's private chambers without being detected." Alexander felt sick.
The scope of the betrayal was beyond anything he had imagined. Not only had Marcus been gathering intelligence, but he had provided the information necessary for a coordinated assassination attempt.
"How many soldiers?" Alexander asked.
50, Marcus replied. "But they're not ordinary soldiers. They're trained assassins, the best each kingdom could provide."
Even with advance warning, stopping them would be extremely difficult. Alexander's mind raced through the implications. In 3 days, during what should have been a joyous celebration, Valdoria would be fighting for its very survival. The kingdom's military forces would be divided and distracted, making the palace vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack Marcus had described. There's more, Marcus added reluctantly. The plan doesn't end with your father's death. The Alliance intends to install Isabella as a puppet queen, with me as her heir. They would control Valdoria through us, using the kingdom's resources and strategic position for their own purposes. Isabella's sobs grew louder. I swear to you, Alexander, I never agreed to Edmund's death. When they first approached me, they said he would be deposed, not killed. When I learned of the assassination plan, I tried to find ways to warn him without exposing Marcus and myself.
When did you learn about the assassination plan? Alexander demanded.
2 weeks ago, Isabella admitted.
I've been trying to find a way out of this nightmare ever since. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Despite everything, he found himself believing her distress was genuine.
The woman before him seemed broken by the weight of her secrets. Very different from the composed queen who had graced the palace halls for 3 years. Why should I believe either of you? Alexander asked. You've been lying to our faces for years. How do I know this isn't just another level of deception? Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small bundle of papers. Because I'm going to give you everything, he said, placing the documents on the table. Every name, every contact, every safe house, every communication method. I'm going to help you destroy the entire network. Alexander looked at the papers skeptically. Why would you do that? Because despite what you might think, I do care about this family, Marcus replied. You welcomed me as a brother. Your father treated me as his own son, and I've watched what this deception has done to my mother. The guilt is destroying her and it's destroying me. And because, Isabella added quietly, we know that if the Alliance succeeds, they won't let us live long enough to enjoy our reward. Marcus and I know too much about their operations. Once we've served our purpose, we'll become liabilities. Alexander picked up the bundle of papers and began examining them. The documents contained names, locations, coded phrases, and what appeared to be a complete organizational chart of the Eastern Alliance's spy network. If authentic, this information would be invaluable in defending against the coming attack. How do I know these are genuine? Alexander asked. Because I'm going to help you test them, Marcus replied. I'm scheduled to send a report to my handler tomorrow morning. We can use that communication to feed false information to the Alliance or to confirm the authenticity of what I've given you. Alexander considered the proposal carefully. It could be another trap, a way to further mislead him or gather intelligence about Valdoria's defenses. But if Marcus and Isabella were telling the truth, their cooperation could be the key to saving not just his father, but the entire kingdom. Even if I believe you, Alexander said finally, even if this information is accurate, and you help us stop the attack, what you've done is still treason. The law is clear about the penalty. We know, Marcus replied simply. We're not asking for forgiveness or mercy. We're asking for the chance to help save the people we've put in danger. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. His personal feelings about Marcus and Isabella would have to take second place to his duty to protect Valdoria. But could he trust them enough to involve them in the kingdom's defense? There's something else you should know, Isabella said suddenly. The Alliance has other agents in the palace. Marcus wasn't the only spy they placed here. Who? Alexander asked sharply. I don't know, Isabella admitted. Marcus was kept isolated from the other operatives for security reasons. But I've suspected for months that someone else has been reporting our activities. Small things, conversations that seemed to leak beyond the people who were present, schedules that appeared to be known by outsiders. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath him once again. If there were other spies in the palace, it meant the security breach was even worse than he had imagined. It also meant that their current conversation might not be as private as he had hoped. We need to get this information to my father immediately, Alexander said, gathering the documents Marcus had provided. But we'll need to be extremely careful about who we involve and how we proceed. Alexander, Marcus said as they prepared to leave the library, there's one more thing. The attack on the ports and the border crossing. They're not just diversions. They're also tests. Tests of what? Tests of Valdoria's response time and defensive capabilities, Marcus explained. The Alliance wants to see how quickly you can mobilize your forces and how effectively you can coordinate your defense. That information will be used to plan future, larger attacks if this operation fails. Alexander realized that they weren't just facing a single assassination attempt, but rather the opening moves in a comprehensive campaign to destroy Valdoria. Every decision he made in the next few days would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. As they left the library together, an unlikely trio bound by secrets and betrayal,
Alexander knew that the coming confrontation with his father would be one of the most difficult moments of his life. He would have to reveal not just Marcus's treachery, but Isabella's as well, potentially destroying his father's heart in the process.
But there was no choice. The survival of the kingdom depended on it, and Alexander was beginning to understand that being a true leader sometimes meant making decisions that caused pain to the people you loved most. The war room in Valdoria Palace had never felt smaller than it did as Alexander spread Marcus's intelligence documents across the massive oak table. King Edmund stood at the far end of the room, his face a mask of controlled fury as he absorbed the full scope of the betrayal that had been perpetrated against his kingdom and his family.
Sir Geoffrey and General Hawthorne, the kingdom's military commander, flanked the king, their expressions equally grim as they studied the evidence. Isabella sat in a chair against the wall, her hands folded in her lap, while Marcus stood near the door like a prisoner awaiting judgment. The dynamic in the room was palpable, everyone acutely aware that they were planning the defense of the kingdom with the help of the very people who had orchestrated its destruction. 50 assassins, General Hawthorne said, his weathered face creased with concern. Elite soldiers from 5 different kingdoms. Even with advance warnings, stopping them will require precise coordination.
King Edmund finally spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion and barely contained rage. "Show me the attack routes they'll use to reach the palace." Marcus stepped forward hesitantly, pointing to a detailed map of the palace and surrounding grounds.
"They'll approach from 3 directions simultaneously," he explained, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "The main force will come through the eastern gardens, using the servants' entrance near the kitchen. The second group will scale the walls near the armory, and the third will use the underground passages that connect to the old dungeon system." "How do they know about the underground passages?" Edmund demanded.
"Those maps are kept in the royal archives. Access is restricted to the royal family and senior advisors." The question hung in the air like an accusation.
Alexander exchanged glances with Sir Geoffrey, both thinking the same thing. If Marcus hadn't provided those maps, then someone else with high-level access had betrayed them. "I gave them architectural plans I found in the library," Marcus admitted. "But those didn't include the underground passages."
Someone else must have provided that information. Edmund's eyes swept the room, landing on each person present.
The knowledge that there was still at least one unknown traitor among his trusted advisors was clearly weighing heavily on the king's mind. "General," Edmund said, turning to Hawthorne, "I want you to personally select 50 of our best soldiers, men whose loyalty is beyond question."
"They'll be our counter-assassination team." "Yes, Your Majesty," Hawthorne replied.
"What about the attacks on the ports in the southern border?" "We'll have to let them happen," Alexander said, causing everyone to turn toward him. "If we position too many troops to defend those areas, the Alliance will know we've uncovered their plan. We need to maintain the appearance that we're unaware of the coordinated attack."
Edmund nodded slowly. "Alexander is right. We'll send minimal reinforcements to the border and ports, just enough to mount a believable defense without depleting our palace guard."
"But Your Majesty," General Hawthorne protested, "those attacks will cost lives. Good soldiers will die to maintain this deception. And if we fail to stop the assassination attempt, many more will die when the Alliance installs their puppet government," Edmund replied grimly. "Sometimes a king must make terrible choices." Isabella finally spoke from her position near the wall. "There might be another way," she said quietly. "The Alliance is expecting regular reports from Marcus. If he fails to send them, they'll know something is wrong and might accelerate their timeline or change their plans entirely." "What are you suggesting?" Alexander asked.
"Let Marcus send false information," Isabella replied. "Tell them the Harvest Festival has been moved to a different date or that you've decided to travel to inspect the border defenses personally. Anything that might delay or disrupt their plans."
Marcus shook his head.
"It won't work. My handlers are too sophisticated to fall for obvious misdirection. Any significant change to the intelligence I've been providing would raise immediate suspicions." "Then what do you suggest?" Edmund asked, his tone making it clear that despite Marcus's cooperation, the king's trust was far from restored. "I suggest we use their plan against them," Marcus replied. "Let them believe everything is proceeding normally, but prepare additional surprises they won't expect." Alexander studied the palace maps, an idea beginning to form in his mind.
What if we turn their own tactics against them? They're planning a coordinated attack from multiple directions, counting on confusion and misdirection to reach their targets.
What if we create our own misdirection?
"Explain," Edmund said. "We stage a fake emergency."
Alexander continued, his voice growing more confident as the plan took shape.
"Something that would require your immediate attention and cause you to change your location within the palace. The assassins will be forced to adapt their approach, and that adaptation will make them vulnerable." General Hawthorne leaned forward with interest.
What kind of emergency? A fire in the eastern wing, Alexander suggested.
It would explain why palace guards are moving through areas they normally wouldn't patrol. And it would provide cover for positioning our counter-assassination team without arousing suspicion. And, Sir Geoffrey added, understanding the implications immediately, it would draw the king away from his private chambers, forcing the assassins to hunt for him in unfamiliar territory. Edmund considered the plan carefully.
It could work, but the timing would have to be perfect. Too early and they'll have time to adjust their entire operation. Too late and they'll already be inside the palace. I can help with the timing, Marcus offered.
I'm supposed to send a final confirmation signal 2 hours before the attack begins. If we coordinate the fake emergency with that signal, we can control exactly when they begin their approach.
Alexander looked at his father, seeing the internal struggle playing out across the king's features. Trusting Marcus was such a critical part of their defense went against every instinct. But they needed someone with insider knowledge to make the deception believable.
There's still the matter of the other spy, Alexander reminded them.
If there's someone else in the palace reporting to the Alliance, they might expose our preparations. Then we feed false information to potential suspects, Edmund decided. We'll prepare different versions of our defensive plan and share them with different groups of advisors.
Whichever version the Alliance responds to will tell us who the spy is. That's dangerous, Sir Geoffrey warned. If the wrong information reaches the assassins, it could compromise our actual defense.
Everything we're doing is dangerous, Edmund replied. But it's the only way to flush out the remaining traitor. Isabella stood up from her chair, drawing everyone's attention.
I want to help with more than just intelligence, she said firmly. I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I want to be part of the defense. Absolutely not, Edmund said immediately. You've done enough damage. Edmund, please, Isabella pleaded, using his given name for the first time since the crisis began. I know I can never undo what I've done, but I can't just sit by and watch while others risk their lives to fix my mistakes.
Alexander studied his stepmother's face, seeing a determination there that he hadn't expected. Despite her betrayal, she seemed genuinely committed to helping defend the kingdom she had helped endanger. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander asked.
Let me be bait, Isabella replied. The Alliance expects me to be crowned queen after your father's death. If I'm seen moving freely around the palace during the attack, the assassins might hesitate or change their approach, giving your counter-team more opportunities to intercept them.
That's suicide, Marcus said sharply. Mother, you can't put yourself in direct danger like that. I've been in danger since the moment I agreed to this deception, Isabella replied.
At least this way my risk serves a purpose.
Edmund was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke.
No, I won't use my wife as bait regardless of what she's done. But, Edmund, Isabella began.
No, he said firmly. We'll find another way. Alexander could see that his father's love for Isabella was warring with his sense of betrayal and duty. Despite everything she had done, Edmund couldn't bring himself to put her in direct danger. We have less than 48 hours to finalize our plans, General Hawthorne reminded them.
Whatever we decide, it needs to be decided quickly. Then let's focus on what we know will work, Alexander said. The fake emergency, the counter-assassination team, and using Marcus's communication to control the timing.
Everything else we can adjust as needed. As the meeting continued into the evening, Alexander found himself watching the interplay between his father and stepmother with fascination and sadness. Despite the magnitude of Isabella's betrayal, there were still moments when their genuine affection for each other showed through the tension and anger. It made the situation even more heartbreaking, knowing that their relationship might never recover from this crisis. When the war council finally ended, Alexander remained behind with his father while the others departed. The two men stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts.
Do you think we can trust them? Edmund asked finally. I think they're more afraid of the Alliance than they are of us, Alexander replied.
That fear might be enough to ensure their cooperation, at least for now. Edmund nodded slowly. And after this is over? Assuming we survive? Alexander had been dreading this question. The law is clear about the penalty for treason, father, but these are extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps exile rather than execution? Perhaps, Edmund said quietly. I find myself hoping we live long enough to face that decision. As Alexander prepared to leave the war room, his father called out to him one final time. Alexander, tomorrow we'll know whether our family survives this crisis intact.
Whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm proud of the man you've become and the leader you're proving to be. The words carried extra weight given the uncertainty of their situation.
Alexander nodded to his father,
then left to make his own final preparations for what might be the longest and most dangerous night in Valdoria's history. The harvest festival dawn broke crisp and clear over Valdoria Palace, with no hint of the deadly game that would unfold before the sun set again. Alexander stood at his chamber window, watching the early morning preparations for what should have been a day of celebration. Colorful banners hung from the palace walls. Market stalls were being erected in the courtyards, and the cheerful sounds of musicians tuning their instruments drifted up from the gardens. To any observer, it appeared to be nothing more than the peaceful beginning of the kingdom's most beloved annual tradition. But Alexander knew better. Hidden among the festival preparations, 50 of Valdoria's most elite soldiers were taking their positions, disguised as merchants, entertainers, and festival workers. In the palace itself, every servant had been carefully vetted and assigned specific locations where they would remain throughout the day. The appearance of normalcy was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to lure the Eastern Alliance assassins into a trap that had been 3 days in the making. A soft knock at his door interrupted Alexander's thoughts.
Marcus entered, looking pale but determined. The young spy had spent the previous evening sending carefully worded messages to his alliance handlers, confirming that all conditions were perfect for their planned attack. Now, just hours before the assassins would begin their approach, he appeared ready to complete his transformation from traitor to defender. "The final confirmation has been sent," Marcus reported. "They'll begin moving into position within the hour." Alexander nodded, studying Marcus's face for any sign of deception. Despite everything they had been through, trust remained fragile between them. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as anyone can be for the possibility of dying to atone for past mistakes," Marcus replied with dark humor. "Though I admit I never imagined my life would lead to this moment." "None of us did," Alexander said. "But we all have to live with the consequences of our choices." The two young men stood in silence for a moment, both aware that this might be their last private conversation. Whatever happened in the coming hours would determine not just their survival, but their relationship going forward.
"Alexander," Marcus said finally, "I want you to know that even though my original mission was deception, the friendship I felt with you was real. You treated me as a brother when you had no obligation to do so."
"I know," Alexander replied. "That's what makes this betrayal so difficult to accept. But it's also what gives me hope that you're truly committed to making things right."
Before Marcus could respond, the sound of bells began ringing throughout the palace, signaling the official start of the harvest festival.
In just 6 hours, when the afternoon celebrations reached their peak and the palace guard was at its most dispersed, 50 assassins would attempt to kill King Edmund and install their puppet government. Alexander and Marcus made their way to the war room where King Edmund, General Hawthorne, and Sir Geoffrey were making final preparations.
Isabella sat in a corner, still excluded from most of the planning despite her offer to help. The strain of the past few days was evident on everyone's faces, but there was also a steely determination that gave Alexander hope. "Status report," Edmund requested as they entered.
"Our counter-assassination teams are in position," General Hawthorne replied. "Team Alpha is covering the Eastern Gardens approach. Team Beta is positioned near the armory walls, and Team Gamma is stationed at the underground passage entrances.
Each team has been equipped with signal horns to coordinate the response once the attack begins." "What about the diversionary attacks on the ports and border?" Alexander asked.
"They began 2 hours ago, exactly as Marcus predicted," Sir Geoffrey reported. "We've sent minimal reinforcements, just enough to make our response appear genuine."
"That's 10. The Alliance should believe we're completely unaware of the main assault." Edmund turned to Marcus. "When will your handlers expect the next report from you?" "Not until after the operation is complete," Marcus replied. "They've gone to communication silence to avoid any possibility of interception. From this point forward, they're operating independently, which means we won't know if they've detected our preparations until they're already inside the palace," Alexander observed grimly.
"Actually," Isabella said, speaking for the first time that morning, "there might be a way to get some advance warning." All eyes turned to her. Despite the tension in the room, Edmund nodded for her to continue.
"The Alliance operatives will be using hand signals and coded phrases to coordinate their movements," she explained. "I learned some of these codes during my initial training years ago. If I position myself where I can observe their approach, I might be able to determine their exact intentions and warn you if they deviate from the expected plan."
Absolutely not, Edmund said immediately.
"I won't have you putting yourself in danger." "Edmund, please listen," Isabella pleaded. "I know these people. I understand their methods."
"I could provide intelligence that might save lives."
Alexander studied his stepmother carefully.
The offer was tempting from a tactical standpoint, but the emotional cost to his father would be enormous if anything happened to her. There might be a compromise, Alexander suggested. What if Isabella observes from a secure location with a clear retreat path? She could provide intelligence without being directly exposed to danger.
Edmund's expression showed his internal struggle. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. The North Tower Observatory. You can see all the approaches from there, and there's only one entrance which we can guard. Isabella's face lit up with gratitude and determination.
Thank you, I won't let you down. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the festival celebrations reached full swing.
The palace courtyards filled with laughing families, the air rich with the scent of roasted meats and fresh bread. Musicians played lively tunes while children ran between the market stalls, and for brief moments it was possible to forget the deadly danger that lurked just beneath the surface of the festivities. Alexander positioned himself in the Great Hall, where he could coordinate communications between the various defense teams while maintaining the appearance of hosting the festival. Every few minutes he received coded updates through the servant network. The Eastern Gardens are blooming beautifully, meant Team Alpha was ready and waiting.
The armory walls need minor repairs, indicated that Team Beta was in position but had spotted suspicious movement. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as the festival reached its most crowded and chaotic point, Isabella's voice crackled through the speaking tube from the North Tower.
"They're coming," she reported, her voice tight with tension. "I can see movement in the forest beyond the Eastern Gardens. At least 15 men, moving in formation toward the servants' entrance."
Alexander felt his heart rate spike as he relayed the message to General Hawthorne. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for.
In the distance he could hear the cheerful sounds of the festival continuing, completely unaware of the deadly drama about to unfold. Team Alpha acknowledges. Came the response through the servant network. "We have visual contact with the eastern approach." Minutes later, Isabella's voice came through the tube again. "Second group spotted near the armory. They're scaling the walls exactly as Marcus predicted and, wait, there's something wrong." "What is it?" Alexander asked urgently.
"There's a third group I wasn't expecting," Isabella replied. "They're approaching from the West Gardens, near the royal family's private entrance."
That wasn't part of the original plan. Alexander's blood ran cold. The West Gardens approach would bring the assassins directly to his father's location in the war room. If there was an additional team that Marcus hadn't known about, their entire defense could be compromised.
"How many?"
Alexander asked. "I count 12, maybe 15, Isabella responded.
"They're moving fast and they know exactly where they're going." Alexander immediately sent word to General Hawthorne about the unexpected third group, but he knew it would take precious minutes to redirect part of their counterforce. In the meantime, the king would be vulnerable. Racing through the palace corridors, Alexander reached the war room just as the first sounds of combat echoed from the Eastern Gardens. The plan was in motion. But with the addition of the unexpected third group, everything had become more dangerous and unpredictable.
"Father, we have a problem," Alexander announced as he burst into the war room.
"There's an additional assault team approaching from the west. We need to evacuate you to a more secure location immediately." Edmund's face hardened with resolve.
No. If we start running now, we'll lose control of the situation.
"We stay and fight." Before Alexander could protest, Marcus stepped forward. "I'll go," he offered.
"I know their tactics and their signals. I can buy time for the counter teams to respond." "You'll be killed," Alexander pointed out.
"Maybe," Marcus replied. "But I'm the reason they're here in the first place. If my death helps stop them, it's a price worth paying." Edmund looked at Marcus for a long moment, and Alexander could see the conflicted emotions playing across his father's face.
Despite everything that had happened, the king had developed genuine affection for the young man who had lived as his stepson.
"Go," Edmund said finally. "But be careful. Your death won't help anyone if it's meaningless." As Marcus left the war room, the sounds of battle grew louder throughout the palace. A harvest festival had become a battlefield, and the fate of Valdoria hung in the balance. Alexander stationed himself at the war room door, sword drawn, prepared to be the last line of defense for his father. Through the windows he could see smoke rising from several parts of the palace as the coordinated attack unfolded. In the distance, the innocent sounds of the festival continued, the common people still unaware that their kingdom's future was being decided in violent combat just a few hundred yards away. The next hour would determine whether the royal family survived, whether Marcus and Isabella could truly redeem themselves, and whether the kingdom of Valdoria would remain free or fall under the control of the Eastern Alliance. As Alexander gripped his sword and waited for the final confrontation, he realized that this day would be remembered in history as either the greatest victory or the most devastating defeat in his family's long reign. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the war room, and Alexander prepared to discover which it would be.
Royal Showdown. William confronts Camilla's son following heartbreaking discovery.